If you're a beginner within the world of photography, you're going to want to take a gander at our Canon EOS Rebel T3i review. You won't notice a plethora of changes on the T3i since last year's T2i, but the changes that Canon made this year are pretty significant. First off, the obvious addition being the flip-out Vari-angle LCD, and it's actually smudge-proof and glare-proof. When it came to being smudge-proof, that's kind of an oxymoron when you talk about LCDs, but it actually held the glare down. The EOS Rebel T3i can now also shoot at 30 frames per second in 1080p video and 60 frames per second at 1280. We have a new Scene Intelligent Auto mode, which is basically an autopilot for this camera, and for the most part the rest of the Rebel T3i remains unchanged. We still get that 18 megapixel APS-C size CMOS sensor that we got last year with the T2i, and many of the controls are the same. Body design and placement of external controls is almost identical. We get this top-mounted jog dial for making manual adjustments. We also get the 4-way directional pad with several button shortcuts. We get the pop-up flash, hot shoe for speed light flash, and Canon also separated the AV out and HDMI terminals from the remote and mic jacks. The EOS Rebel T3i ships with an 18 to 135mm EFS kit lens that has autofocus and image stabilization. It has an 1120 mAh battery pack, and it records to SD, SDHC, and SDXC cards. Now let's talk about the T3i's image quality. Since we get the same 18 megapixel sensor as last year, image quality remains unchanged from the T2i. And this camera likes to shoot at high ISOs whenever it can. There are some outdoor experiences we had where we were shooting at ISO 3200. The good news is the high ISO performance on this camera is great. Noise is managed very well. When it came to color and detail, the T3i is definitely a long shot from the original T1i. Shooting at 1080p in video mode was hit or miss with this camera, however. For detail in video mode, this camera exhibits a great amount for close-up subjects, but when it comes to the color palette, it's a bit pale with this camera. Also, there are times when the auto exposure on this camera during video mode will go haywire. Bright, dark, bright, dark. One recommendation while shooting in video mode is not to use the tap shutter button for focusing, because it makes a very loud sound and it's just not enjoyable. We used manual focus because we couldn't get the autofocus to work properly in video mode. When it came to shooting, we found that the new Scene Intelligent Auto was a bit overkill. The camera really wouldn't let us adjust anything outside of drive mode. Now there's also a creative auto mode which lets you set the depth of field, color, and brightness, so we felt that the creative auto mode was a bit more useful. The T3i also includes the auto depth of field shooting mode. Here the camera will focus on the primary subject and blur the background or foreground depending on what it feels is the most relevant. This is hit or miss, especially for advanced shooters who really want control of what's being focused. Another tool for beginners is Feature Guide, which displays a little sentence or two about what each control is on the camera. For manual controls, the T3i has an ISO range of 100 to 6400, and that's expandable to 12,800. We have a shutter speed of 30 seconds to 1/4000th, and we get various white balance modes. Like we said earlier, if you leave the camera in ISO auto, it's going to pick the highest ISO it can. Canon's 63 zone metering mode worked great, and autofocus, it has a 9-point system, and that worked very well. Overall, menus are great. This camera is very fast. It shoots at 3.7 frames per second as well, and it's just as friendly as any of the advanced Canon DSLRs, only it's tailored specifically for the beginner or the student. So let's wrap things up here with the InfoSync diagnosis on the Canon EOS Rebel T3i. We have a new Vari-angle LCD, the ability to shoot at 30 frames per second in 1080p and 60 in 1280. There's a new Scene Intelligent Auto mode, we have a new Feature Guide, and almost everything else is carried over from last year's T2i. Even though the T3i's upgrades may seem minor, it's definitely a better camera because of them. And the best part of this camera is that it's the same price as last year's T2i. So if you have the option, go for the T3i. If you're more of a creative shooter and you don't have Photoshop at home, look at the Pentax KR because it has a lot more image effects and creative features than the T3i. But for the average student or beginner, the Canon EOS Rebel T3i is a great option out there. We highly recommend it. For InfoSync World, I'm Mike Broman.